Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Hyperabyssic Ontology, a Lacanian reading of the Tree of Life, Part 1, Creation. How does the Tree of Life get started? The question is equivalent to another. How, or rather why, did creation occur? The issue at hand, I should stress at the outset, is ideological rather than theistic. In other words, my concern is to examine the metaphorical, which is to say anthropological, significance of the Western religious myth of the supernatural origin of the natural order. The material origins of the cosmos I leave to the physical sciences. My interest is in the meaning of the world for humans and of persons in relation to the world, in light of Western creation mythology, particularly as esoterically interpreted by Kabbalistic traditions. In his work, Agon Towards a Theory of Revisionism, Harold Bloom argues for a continuity between Valentinus' account of the demiurge, based on his strong dualist reading of Plato's Timaeus, and Isaac Luria's theosophy of Tzimtzum, the self-contraction of the primordial divine light, or Ein Sof, leading to the catastrophic breaking of the vessels from which the world is salvaged. I find this narrative compatible with the detonation of the prehistoric singularity, or Big Bang, which originated the physical universe. Of course, my point in drawing this connection is hermeneutical, not literal. Luria's creation narrative isn't about the separation of the strong and weak forces billions of years ago within the primordial monoblock that initiated the explosive expansion of the universe. Luria is rather engaged in theological meditations on the function of Torah observance, mitzvot, in relation to the exiled status of the nation of Israel and its potential restoration. His exegetical contribution to the rabbinical dialogue is to link Torah observance to the resuscitation of the divine light hidden within the broken crockery shards, the dysfunctional shells or clipot of human history. This process is tikkun, described by Gershom Scholem as religious and contemplative activity aiming at, quote, the restoration of the world of Messiah to its spiritual place, its complete separation from the world of the klipoth, and the achievement of a permanent blissful state of communion between every creature and God, which the klipoth will be unable to disrupt or prevent, unquote. Lurianic Kabbalah's creation narrative nevertheless possesses a number of fascinating family resemblances to the kinds of models used by cosmologists to represent the physical event of the Big Bang. Therefore, speculating on Luria's narrative in light of the discoveries of modern physics may help illuminate certain nooks and crannies of modern cosmology and, vice versa, and can assist the hermeneutical task of interpreting the obscurities of Lurianic Kabbalah. Bloom's continuity between Valentinus and Luria does not posit a lineage of direct historical influence that would arise, for example, if Luria had implausibly been a reader of Valentinus. Rather, Bloom explains, quote, what unites them is a catastrophe theory of creation, and what urges me towards them is my growing conviction that any adequate theory of poetic creativity must be a catastrophe theory, unquote. Bloom's retroactive critical gaze develops his reading based on the synchronic thematic similarities between two authors of otherwise widely disparate milieus. Furthermore, through his reading strategy, a diachronic connection, in terms of the fictitious but critically useful grouping named Gnostic, is retroactively posited between the two figures, solely yet sufficiently in terms of the hermeneutical usefulness of their thematic association from the viewpoint of Bloom's theory of modern aesthetic creativity. He unfolds a calculated historical misreading into a thematically rich hermeneutical reinterpretation of Gnostic rhetoric in terms of modern psychology, based around the criterion that, quote, a gnosis of catastrophe creation is a path to freedom, unquote. For my own purposes, I will apply Bloom's paradigm of Gnostic creativity to conceptualize the true will in terms of the Freudian theory of the drive. Along these lines, I fully endorse Bloom's equation of Luria's Gnostic Kabbalistic concept of Tzimtzum with Freud's death drive. Bloom explains, quote, Freud, though rigorously opposed to every religious formulation, someday may be judged as closer to gnosis than the overly Gnosticizing Jung ever was, as we come to comprehend better the consequences of Freud's final dualisms. Gnosis affirms that fantasy must be primary in our belated condition, and where the drive for freedom becomes also the death drive, where creativity and catastrophe become indistinguishable, Freud affirms the same. Unquote. Freud particularly affirms the same in his short, dense essay Negation, Verneinung, published in 1925. Here, Freud applies the dualistic theory of the primary drives first advanced in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, from 1920, to the psychological origin of what he calls the function of intellectual judgment, which acts to affirm or deny the subject matter of thoughts. He concludes that, quote, affirmation as being a substitute for union belongs to eros, while negation, the derivative of expulsion, belongs to the instinct of destruction, unquote. Negation as the expression of the death drive takes precedence over affirmation in the order of the psyche's development. The experiential space for the operations of eros, or the drive to attach affect to objects, is first opened up by the self-contraction of the ego or sense of self-identity from its initial identification with the field of its experiences. Or, as Freud writes, quote, the contrast between what is subjective and what is objective does not exist from the first, unquote. Therefore, the death drive expressing itself in psychological negation is the ultimate primordial drive founding subjectivity. Finally, and counterintuitively from the standpoint of the Jungian paradigm's organic humanism, Harold Bloom grasps that Freud's concept of the death drive is a theory of creative freedom. Freud insists that through its openness to negation, quote, the thinking process frees itself from the limitations of repression and enriches itself with the subject matter without which it could not work efficiently, unquote. Creative freedom is a precipitate of the collision of the psyche and its environment, not the sublime stabilization of the libidinal dynamic in and through the totality of the self-archetype, as it is for Jung. The death drive is the anterior basis for creative expression, the primordial catastrophe that founds the tensions necessary for free creation. Correspondingly, the creation of the tree of life begins with a primordial psychic evacuation, Luria's Simsum, which opens up a space for the inscription of the imaginary or linguistic construction of the psyche in terms of the historically prevailing symbolic linguistic ideological social order. However, like the background radiation that still pervades the universe from the Big Bang, the trace of the primordial psychic negation persists and insists as the function of a psychic negation that resists and disrupts the psyche's adequate inscription in terms of the prevailing symbolic order. The persistence of this psychological gap between the ego and its society, the excessive and incomplete quality of the psyche, corresponds to the Lacanian real, the third term of Lacan's trinity of the imaginary, symbolic, and the real, whose interaction constitutes the subject understood in terms of the unconscious being structured as a language. The description of Simsum in Hayim Vital's Tree of Life, or Etz Hayim, a summary of Isaac Luria's oral teachings, reads, quote, you should know that before the emanations were emanated, and the creations created, most supreme simple light filled the whole of existence. There was no vacant place, no aspect of empty space or void, but everything was filled by that simple light of the infinite. It had no aspect of beginning or end, but was all one simple, completely uniform light. And this is what is called the light of the infinite. When it arose in his simple will to create worlds and to emanate emanations, to bring out the perfection of his actions, his names, and his attributes, then the infinite contracted itself at its midpoint, in the exact center of its light, and after he contracted that light and withdrew away from that midpoint to the sides surrounding it, it left a vacant place, an empty space and a void, like this. The text has an image of a circle with a dot in its center. The circle represents the open void and empty place preceding material creation, a space of pure negative potentiality, contrasted with the infinite positive actuality of the divine pleroma. The primordial void evacuated by Tzimtzum is something like a macro-scale version of a quantum probability field, the instant before it collapses into a measured event. Or, the void can be conceived as analogous to the state of the space-time continuum before the detonation of the prehistoric singularity, when the cosmological constants had yet to be established. The evacuated void is fecund with creative potential. Vital says, within that empty place he emanated, created, formed, and made all the worlds, every one of them. Unquote. Despite the infinite creation filling the space of all potential realities, the multiverse remains incomplete. Luria Vital explains, quote, this sphere did not, however, touch the light of the infinite that surrounded it on all sides, for if it had touched it, it would have returned to what it had been, and would have been nullified by the light of the infinite. Then its power would never have appeared at all, and everything would have been only the light of the infinite as it was in the beginning. Therefore, this circular sphere is close to the circle of the infinite, but does not touch it. Unquote. I read the field of negative potential from which actuality precipitates in terms of Crowley's 0 to the 0 power, the Kabbalistic 0 in the 0 equals 2 formula. The infinite potentiality represented by the Kabbalistic 0 stands in excess of what any finite actuality or universe, the 2 of the 0 equals 2 formula, can instantiate. For example, an infinite potentiality includes all possible fictional universes, at least some of which can't be actualized within the set of possible systems of physics. Supernatural phenomenon, for example, may be impossible in any possible universe, while they can be freely posited in fiction. Therefore, there subsists an ontological gap between the primordial matrix of creation and material actuality. This gap, of course, corresponds to the Lacanian real. Within the primordial circle is the center of light. The center can only be retroactively located after the occurrence of Tzimtzum, because it does not exist within the undifferentiated pleroma of Ein Sof Hour. The point source of creation only appears after creation is underway, when a space has already been cleared such that a discrete point within that space can be symbolized. The symbolism of the point and the circle recalls Hadith's speech in the second chapter of the Book of the Law. Quote, I, Hadith, am the complement of Nu, my bride. I am not extended, and Kabs is the name of my house. In the sphere I am everywhere the center, as she the circumference is nowhere found, yet she shall be known and I never. L2 verses 2 to 4. Read in conjunction with the passages from Vital's Tree of Life cited above, the text of the Book of the Law implies that any point in the multiverse is, from its own perspective, the center of its reality from which a Tree of Life can coalesce, or from which experience can potentially develop subjectivity. Similarly, every point in the universe is observationally equidistant in space from the point event of the Big Bang, because every point in space was coalesced with the monoblock during event 1 and subsequently expanded outwards to its present relative position. The location of the Big Bang can therefore never be retroactively situated in space. This absence of a center to space means that every point in space is, if only from its own inertial frame of reference, the center of the universe. Nor is it necessary to stop at one universe. Haim Vital writes, quote, it is clear and obvious that many different kinds of worlds were emanated, created, formed, and made, thousands upon thousands and myriads upon myriads. Every single one of them is inside the empty place that was described above, and nothing is outside it. Every world has its own individual 10 sephirot, and every sephirah that is within each world is also made up of 10 individual sephirot. All of them are in the form of concentric circles with no end to their number. They're like the layers of an onion, with rings inside each other, the way circles are illustrated in geometry books, unquote. I read Vital's remark that nothing is outside the space of Tzimtzum to mean that literally nothing, 0 to the 0 power, lies outside the multiverse of physical reality. The Kabbalistic 0 describes the ultimate character of manifest being, not another higher reality beyond or above our own in terms of which our existence is emanated or reflected. Therefore, the process of Simsum should really be understood as the ultimate horizon for the creative unfolding of the tree of life, and not its emanation from an infinite supernatural unity or negative existence. Yet, because of the very absence of a spiritual unity underlying the universe, the sight of spirit, in its most robustly Hegelian dialectical human communal sense, is irreducibly plural and diverse. Any subject can potentially posit itself as a blazing center of creative theurgic light in a quest for the gnosis of its true will. Likewise, reading Luria psychologically, Ein Sof stands for a primordial narcissism, retroactively posited as preceding Oedipal castration, where castration is read by Lacan as a metaphor for the psyche's socialization through the learning of language. However, according to Lacan, there is no such actual experience as castration, only the psyche's unfulfillable fantasy of a return to the same. In other words, Freud's primordial negation, like castration, names yet another retroactive representation of the absent real, the missing center of the modern subject's ontology. Nevertheless, the retroactive gaze that seeks the repetition and return of the absent and unrepeatable primordial narcissism is itself the operation of the death drive and a function of psychic negation. The function of the death drive withdraws the subject from an immediate affective absorption with its environment, distracting it into developing more and more complicated modes of creative behavior to cope with its inability to stabilize a state of narcissism. The subject cannot sustain solipsism. It can neither sever self-consciousness from dependence on its material basis, holding aloof from its historical entanglements, nor totalize the field of its experience such that its mental fantasies and physical reality could directly correspond, free from the cut of the real that castrates desire. On the basis of the preceding, the vertical dimension of the tree of life should not be interpreted, except as a metaphor for material processes, either as a descending emanation of spiritual unity, nor an ascent departing from the material and rising through increasingly subtle planes of ideality. The transworldly return to the pre-Oedipal real is not achievable by the psyche because of the absence of the real. The negative gap of the subject's incomplete ontology is the very phenomenal presence through absence of the real, the authentic trace of Crowley's Kabbalistic zero. Therefore, movement down the tree stands for the development of the psyche, and movement up the tree for the subject's regression or introversion onto the imaginary through contemplation, therapy, or psychosis. Both trajectories involve gains and losses, insights and anxieties. Maneuverability upon the tree is a goal of magical practice, because by climbing through its branches, the oracle of the tree can be read inscribed in the traces of the real. Love is the law, love under will.